Hello, my dear mastermind. You didn't do something dramatic. You did something inconvenient, something uncomfortable, something most people quietly avoid because it threatens the stories they tell themselves. You chose the harder path when the easier one was available and socially acceptable. And that's why they don't know how to read you now. They were used to predictable reactions, familiar trade-offs, people bending just enough to keep things smooth. You didn't bend. You didn't justify it either. You made the choice and moved forward without asking anyone to understand. That's what disrupted the pattern. Most people rely on shared hesitation to feel normal. When everyone avoids the same line, it becomes invisible. You crossed it calmly, without announcement, and suddenly the line existed. They don't know how to categorize someone who acts without needing consensus. You didn't rebel. You didn't perform courage. You simply acted in alignment when misalignment would have been easier. That kind of decision doesn't create noise. It creates confusion. Because now they can't tell whether you're principled or unpredictable, controlled or uncertain, cooperative or independent. Their usual frameworks don't apply. And when frameworks fail, people hesitate. They start watching instead of assuming. That's where your unreadability begins. They keep replaying the moment in their heads, trying to locate the rule you broke. Not because it was written, because it was assumed. Everyone else saw the same choice and quietly looked away. You didn't look away. You didn't make a statement about it either. That's what unsettled them. If you had protested, they could have labeled you. If you had complained, they could have dismissed you. If you had explained yourself, they could have negotiated with your reasons. You gave them none of that. You acted once and let the action stand without commentary. Now they don't know what motivates you. And when people can't identify motive, they lose leverage. They don't know whether you'll compromise for comfort, approval, or timing. They don't know what strains work on you. That uncertainty forces caution. They start measuring words around you, reconsidering assumptions they'd normally make without thinking. Because someone who does the difficult thing without advertising it isn't chasing validation. And people who aren't chasing validation don't move the way others expect. You signaled neither virtue nor defiance. You signaled independence. That's harder to interpret than rebellion. Rebellion reacts to the system. Independence ignores it. And when someone ignores the system calmly, the system doesn't know how to respond. From that point on, every interaction feels slightly off to them. Not hostile, just uncertain. They watch you more closely now. Not because they distrust you, but because they can't predict you the way they predict everyone else. Your choices aren't optimized for comfort or optics. They're optimized for coherence. And coherence doesn't announce itself. It shows up as consistency across moments when others would adjust. They notice you don't rush to smooth tension. Don't overcorrect to maintain harmony. Don't perform flexibility to reassure anyone. That's what makes you difficult to read. People are readable when they're negotiating something. Approval, belonging, advantage. You weren't negotiating, you already decided where you stood before anyone asked. That decision removed tells they rely on. No visible reaction, no hesitation cues. No need to align with the room. So the room starts aligning around you instead. Not out of admiration, out of recalibration. They're trying to figure out whether you'll bend next time, whether the line you crossed was situational or structural. And the more time passes without contradiction, the more they realize it wasn't a one-off. It was how you operate. That's when unreadability becomes position. That's when their curiosity turns inward. They stop asking what you did and start asking why they didn't. And that question is uncomfortable because your action didn't expose a rule. It exposed a preference for safety, for consensus, for not standing alone when alignment costs something. Your silence did more than confrontation ever could. It created an unavoidable contrast without accusation. Now every time they hesitate, they remember that you didn't. Every time they rationalize inaction, they remember that you acted without justification. That's why they don't know how to read you. You became a mirror they didn't ask for, one that reflects back the choices they avoid and the compromises they normalize. And mirrors make people uneasy when they're not ready to see clearly. You didn't become harder, you became clearer. And clarity is disruptive to systems built on shared avoidance. They can't tell if you'll play along next time. They can't assume you'll accept the same shortcuts. So they stay alert. They leave space. They approach you carefully. Not because you demand it, because they no longer know where your limits are. And that uncertainty changes everything. Now they're trying to place you somewhere safe in their minds. And they can't. You didn't fit the category of difficult because you weren't disruptive. You didn't fit hero because you didn't seek recognition. You didn't fit outsider because you never detached emotionally. You stayed present without participating in the compromise. That's what makes you unreadable. Most people reveal themselves through what they're willing to tolerate. You revealed yourself through what you weren't. You didn't tolerate the easy option when it cost integrity. That moment in the meeting when everyone nodded at the compromise, the one that felt wrong but looked convenient. They all agreed, all signed off. You were the only one who said, "I can't support this." No speech, no explanation, just clarity. The room went silent. Not hostile, confused. Because you didn't argue the point. You simply removed yourself from participating in something misaligned. They couldn't tell if you were principled or just difficult. That uncertainty is what began everything. You raised no threats. You raised no stakes. You simply demonstrated that your decisions aren't negotiable once they're made. And that realization lingers. It makes people cautious without making them defensive. They can't interpret you because interpretation usually relies on pressure points. You removed those, no urgency, no need for approval, no emotional bargaining. And when those levers disappear, reading becomes impossible. That's not intimidation. That's independence. From here, the distance becomes consistent, not physical, psychological. They stop assuming access to your reasoning. Stop expecting explanations. Stop thinking they can predict your next move by studying your past behavior. Because what you showed them wasn't a reaction pattern, it was a principle. And principles don't adjust themselves to keep others comfortable. That's the difference they're struggling to name. You didn't make a difficult choice to prove strength. You made it because it was the correct one, regardless of outcome. That removes you from the emotional framework most people live inside. The framework where decisions are traded for acceptance, silence for safety, compromise for belonging. You exited that framework without announcing it. Now they're left interacting with someone who doesn't operate on incentives they understand. Someone who won't trade coherence for ease. That's why they're unsure how to read you. Because reading someone requires shared assumptions. You broke those assumptions calmly, without resistance, without superiority, just clarity, and clarity, once demonstrated, can't be ignored, and that's where it settles for good. They stop trying to decode you, stop looking for hidden motives or future concessions, because they finally understand something simple and unsettling. You're not operating from reaction. You're operating from coherence. And coherence doesn't send signals for interpretation. It just holds. You didn't do what others wouldn't to stand out. You did it because you couldn't do otherwise and remain intact. That's why they're unsure how to read you now. Reading relies on strain, on seeing what someone does when comfort is threatened. You already showed them. So now they don't rush you. They don't restrict you. They don't assume compliance. They adjust. Quietly, going forward. You didn't change who you were. You revealed it. And revelation like that doesn't invite commentary. It changes behavior. They may never say it out loud, but they know. You crossed a line others avoided, not to be brave, but to stay whole. What remains after that is silence of a different kind. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of recognition. They stop trying to interpret you through old lenses because those lenses no longer work. You proved that your decisions don't require permission, and that changes how people behave around you going forward. They become more careful, not out of fear, but out of respect for something they can't negotiate with. You aren't unpredictable. You're consistent at a level they're not used to seeing. And consistency without compromise is unreadable to anyone still making trade-offs with themselves. That's why they hesitate now. That's why they watch. That's why they adjust. You didn't become mysterious by hiding. You became unreadable by standing exactly where you were, refusing to move just to make things easier. And that's the last shift. They don't label you anymore. Labels require familiarity. Familiarity requires access. You closed that quietly the moment you acted without explanation. Not out of distance, out of closure. You didn't do what others wouldn't to create tension. You did it to remove it from inside yourself. And when someone operates from that place, reading them becomes unnecessary. The distance that forms afterward isn't something you create. It's something they install. They begin treating your presence differently, not with hostility, not with admiration, with measurement. Every word they say around you gets weighed before it leaves their mouth. Every assumption gets tested internally before it becomes action. They've learned that proximity to someone who finished their internal negotiation requires a different kind of attention, not the attention that comes from fear. The attention that comes from not knowing where the limits are until they're already behind them. So they stop approaching limits altogether. They stay centered. They stay careful. And that carefulness becomes lasting. Nothing waiting for approval. That's what unsettles people the most. Not mystery. Decisiveness. You move without asking the room what it thinks. You decide without needing reaction. You stay consistent when comfort would have justified compromise. That consistency doesn't invite interpretation, it ends it. So they stop guessing, stop projecting, stop trying to figure you out. You're not someone to persuade, not someone to manage, not someone to pull into hesitation. You did what others wouldn't, not to stand apart, but to stay whole. And wholeness, like that, doesn't need to be read. It's already understood, much later. Usually when nothing is at stake anymore, they realize the real reason they couldn't read you. It wasn't because you were complex, it was because you were done explaining, done adjusting yourself to fit the moment. People who are still bargaining with themselves leave signals everywhere. Doubt, hope, hesitation. You didn't. You made one clean choice when it mattered. And that choice marked a transition inside you. From that point on, your behavior didn't need to convince anyone. It only needed to remain consistent. What settles into place after that is something most people never experience in their relationships. Certainty without explanation. They stop needing to understand your reasoning because your actions have already established a pattern they can't argue with. You don't waver when conditions shift. You don't adjust when expectations increase. You don't soften when it would benefit the room. That consistency creates a foundation they didn't know was missing from their other interactions. Interactions where people bend, where positions change based on audience, where principles get negotiated in real time. You stepped away from all of that, and stepping away from negotiation doesn't create confusion forever. It creates clarity about who someone is when no one is watching. They know now. You're the same person alone that you are in company. And that kind of consistency is so rare that once they've seen it, they stop questioning it. They just adjust their behavior around it. You weren't. You did what others wouldn't. And in doing so, you removed yourself from the endless cycle of reaction and approval. What they sensed wasn't danger. It was certainty. And certainty is rare. It doesn't argue. It doesn't perform. It doesn't explain itself. It simply stands. That's why they're unsure how to read you now. And once someone has chosen themselves, without noise, without witnesses, without asking permission, the world doesn't need a manual to understand them. It just adjusts, and that's where it truly ends. Not with recognition, not with understanding, but with acceptance that doesn't ask questions anymore. There's a moment, usually long after everything's settled, when they realize what your choice required of you. Not in drama, not in loss, in the quiet discomfort of standing alone, when alignment was available for the price of a small compromise. They begin to understand that the easy path wasn't just easier socially, it was easier internally. It required no confrontation with yourself, no examination of what you actually stand for when the cost is real. You chose the more demanding inner path, and that choice clarified something they're still avoiding in themselves. The question of whether they're willing to be inconvenient, to be uncomfortable, to be misunderstood. When you made that choice without announcement, you answered a question they haven't asked themselves yet. And now they carry that question quietly, not as judgment, as invitation, to see if they can do the same when their moment arrives. You simply stopped participating in the internal negotiations. Most people never finish. That's why they can't read you now. Reading requires movement, signals, micro-adjustments. You removed all of it when you made the choice others wouldn't. From that moment forward, your presence stopped asking for interpretation. With you, outcomes aren't uncertain. You don't drift. You don't bend with context. You don't soften to be understood. You remain whole, whether it's convenient or costly. And wholeness at that level doesn't confuse people forever. It teaches them where not to push, where not to assume. That's the final consequence of doing what others wouldn't. You didn't gain mystery. You gained presence. And presence doesn't need to be read, it's felt. The effect doesn't diminish over time. If anything, it compounds, because every future interaction carries the memory of that first moment you didn't bend. Every conversation, every decision, every situation where compromise is available. They remember. They remember that you have a line. They remember that the line isn't movable. They remember that you don't announce where it is. You just stop participating when it's crossed. That uncertainty about where your limits are keeps them from testing. It keeps them from assuming. It keeps them from treating you the way they treat everyone else, who can be managed, who can be moved, who can be persuaded, with the right expectations at the right time. You've proven you can't, and proof doesn't need repetition. It establishes itself once and holds, and the final realization comes quietly, without drama or resistance. They understand that nothing about you needs decoding anymore. You didn't retreat into silence. You didn't become guarded. You didn't sharpen yourself into something unsettling. You simply finished the inner conversation most people postpone their entire lives. That's why they can't read you. Reading assumes uncertainty. It assumes there's something still forming, still shifting, still open to impact. You aren't. You're settled. And settled people don't broadcast signals for interpretation. They don't leak intention. They don't negotiate their presence. This is where a lasting understanding settles in. They realize that your unreadability wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a performance designed to create distance or mystique. It was a natural consequence of finishing something most people never complete. The alignment between who you are and what you do, between what you believe and how you move, between your internal state and your external action. When those things are synchronized, there's nothing left to interpret. No gap between intention and behavior. No space between principle and practice. You close that gap. And closing it didn't make you harder to understand. It made you no longer open to misinterpretation, because there's only one version of you. The one that shows up regardless of context, regardless of audience, regardless of cost. And once people see that version clearly, they stop looking for others. They accept what's in front of them, and they adjust accordingly. Not because you demand it, but because ambiguity can't survive near someone who has resolved themselves internally. You didn't do what others wouldn't to prove strength. You did it to end division inside yourself. And once that division ends, the outside world adjusts automatically. You aren't unclear, you're complete. They didn't see strength when it was happening. That's the part people always get wrong. When pressure closes in, when options disappear, when the margin for error vanishes, strength doesn't look impressive. It looks quiet. It looks restrained. It looks like someone refusing to lose cohesion, when losing cohesion would have been understandable. You weren't dramatic under pressure. You weren't loud about it. You didn't signal endurance or announce resilience. You absorbed weight without advertising the cost. And because of that, most people misread what they were witnessing. They thought you were fine, or lucky, or untouched. They didn't realize you were carrying pressure that would have disrupted their sense of direction entirely. Pressure reveals material, not talent, not ambition. material. What someone is actually built from when there's no room for performance. You didn't rush to escape it. You didn't offload it onto others. You didn't numb yourself just to survive the moment. You stayed present while the pressure intensified. That's the difference they're only noticing now. Anyone can look capable when conditions cooperate. Very few remain intact when conditions refuse to. You didn't harden yourself into something unfeeling. You didn't collapse into reaction. You adapted internally and held your center without knowing when relief would arrive. That's why the pressure didn't expose weakness. It exposed structure. And structure doesn't announce itself while it's being tested. It simply holds. Now, with distance, people are starting to replay those moments, recalculate what they saw. And a question forms that didn't exist before. Not admiration, not envy, curiosity. Because if you could carry that kind of weight without breaking form, then what you're made of isn't ordinary. It's something most people never had to discover about themselves. They start retracing the pressure point by point, trying to locate the moment you should have given in, the deadline that should have rattled you, the loss that should have knocked you off center, the silence that should have made you panic. But every place they expect collapse, they find composure instead. Not because it was easy, because you didn't allow the pressure to define your internal state. Most people negotiate with pressure. They bargain with it. They try to outrun it, or soften it, or explain it away. You didn't. You accepted it as a condition and adjusted yourself accordingly. That's why you didn't flinch. Flinching assumes the pressure has authority. You never granted it that. You understood something early that others only learn after breaking a few times. Pressure doesn't respond to emotion. It responds to structure. Panic feeds it. Resistance sharpens it, but alignment neutralizes it. You aligned your behavior to reality, instead of demanding reality bend to you. That's what carried you through. Not force, not optimism, not blind toughness, precision. You chose exactly what to hold and exactly what to let go of. You didn't waste energy reacting to every shift. You conserved it. You distributed it. You stayed deliberate while others exhausted themselves trying to escape discomfort. And that's when the real separation occurred. While they were draining themselves emotionally, you were stabilizing. While they were waiting for conditions to improve, you were improving your tolerance for conditions not improving. That difference compounds quietly. It doesn't look impressive in the moment. It looks uneventful. But uneventful endurance under pressure is the clearest indicator of what someone is actually built from. That quiet endurance is what makes them uneasy now. Because from the outside, it didn't look heroic enough to explain survival. There was no dramatic stand, no visible breaking point, no emotional release they could point to and say, that's where it happened. You simply stayed functional while the environment applied weight, and functionality under sustained pressure is rare. Most people can endure spikes, short bursts of intensity, a crisis with an end in sight. What overwhelms them is duration, pressure without a clear finish line. You handled that, not by numbing yourself, not by pretending it didn't exist, by remaining internally organized while time stretched on. That's why people couldn't read you correctly then. They were looking for signals they recognized: strain, frustration, desperation. You didn't display them, not because you didn't feel them, but because you didn't let them drive. You separated sensation from action. You felt the weight without letting it dictate your movement. That separation is a skill most people never develop, because most people escape before they have to. You didn't have that luxury. So you adapted. You learned how to carry pressure without leaking it into your behavior. That's what they're trying to understand now. How someone can be under that kind of load and still move with intention, still make clean decisions, still preserve clarity. They're realizing that what protected you wasn't toughness. It was discipline over your internal response. And discipline at that level isn't loud. It's invisible until the moment passes and you're still standing where others would have folded. That discipline is what reframed everything once the pressure lifted, when people expected you to unravel afterward, to vent, to drift into recovery mode, to show the cost in visible ways. You didn't. You didn't swing to the other extreme. You didn't seek compensation for what you endured. You resumed movement as if continuity had never been broken. That's when they realized the pressure hadn't carved damage into you. It had clarified you. You didn't come out brittle or hardened. You came out calibrated, more precise about what matters, less reactive to what doesn't. Pressure stripped away the unnecessary habits people rely on to feel stable. You didn't lose stability when that happened. You gained it, because what remained was something that didn't depend on comfort or certainty, and that unsettled them more than collapse ever would have. Collapse is familiar. Calibration isn't. They couldn't map your response onto anything they knew. You weren't triumphant. You weren't resentful. You weren't chasing relief. You moved with the same internal timing you had before the pressure arrived. That consistency forced a realization they didn't want to make. The pressure didn't reveal a hidden reserve you tapped into temporarily. It revealed your baseline. You didn't rise to meet the pressure. You met it from where you already were. That's why people started asking a different question. Not how did you survive, but what were you built on before survival was required? That question doesn't come from admiration. It comes from disorientation. Because if your baseline could absorb that kind of pressure without distortion, then the rules they live by aren't universal. They start to see how much of their own stability is borrowed from comfort, timing, or reassurance. Remove those supports and everything wobbles. Yours didn't. You didn't need favorable conditions to remain coherent. You didn't need certainty to make decisions. You didn't need permission to keep moving forward. That's why pressure didn't draw chaos from you. It drew clarity. Clarity about what could be dropped, what could be delayed, what could be endured without commentary. Most people try to manage pressure by managing appearances. You managed it by managing inputs. You controlled what entered your internal space and what didn't. You didn't let urgency rewrite your priorities. You didn't let uncertainty set your pace. That kind of control doesn't come from willpower alone. It comes from familiarity with discomfort, from having stayed present long enough in hard conditions to know what actually threatens you and what just feels loud. They begin to understand that what carried you through wasn't extraordinary talent. It was an internal order that didn't give way when the environment became unstable. And internal order under pressure is something people can't imitate. It either exists or it doesn't. Yours did. That's why the pressure didn't command you. It tested you and moved on. And now, with distance, People are left with a realization they can't ignore. Whatever you're made of, it isn't common. It's something formed where escape wasn't an option, and staying intact was the only way forward. And that realization is where everything settles. People stop trying to reduce your endurance to motivation or mindset because neither explains what they witnessed. Motivation flares briefly and fades. Mindset fluctuates. What you showed didn't fluctuate. It held. You didn't borrow strength from belief. You didn't lean on optimism to get through. You operated from something quieter and far more durable, an internal agreement that you would remain intact regardless of conditions. That agreement doesn't look impressive. While it's happening, it looks uneventful. But uneventful endurance under sustained pressure is the rarest thing there is. That's why people are only now asking what you're really made of. Because answers that rely on talent or luck don't survive close inspection. They can't explain why you didn't lose coherence when there was no reward for holding together. They can't explain why urgency never steered your behavior. They can't explain why, when everything tightened, you didn't lose clarity. What carried you through wasn't resistance. It was alignment. You stayed aligned with yourself when abandoning that alignment would have made the moment easier. And most people don't do that. They trade themselves away to escape discomfort. You didn't. That choice doesn't announce itself. It integrates. It becomes the way you move afterward. Calm, exact, unavailable to pressure. That relies on urgency to function. That's the material they're trying to understand now. Not muscle, not toughness. Integrity under weight. And once someone has seen that in action, they don't forget it. They don't test it again. They adjust around it. Because pressure only works where something is willing to give. You proved, without saying a word, that you weren't. And that adjustment is the last signal. When people stop testing you, stop escalating, stop assuming pressure will move you, it means the conclusion has already formed, not emotionally, structurally. They understand now that whatever you went through didn't just toughen you for a moment. It clarified a lasting boundary. You don't bend, because bending was never part of how you survived. You learned early that breakdown resolves nothing. That urgency offers nothing. That pressure only has influence over people who need relief. You didn't. You stayed with the weight long enough for it to reveal its limits. And once you've seen the limits of pressure, it never feels absolute again. That's why you move the way you do now, unrushed, unprovoked, unavailable to timelines built on uncertainty. People feel that immediately. They sense that whatever they might try has already been tested somewhere you don't talk about, somewhere they wouldn't have lasted. That's why the question keeps circling back to the same place. What are you really made of? Not because they want to copy it, because they know they can't. It was formed where exits weren't available and excuses didn't work. It was formed by staying intact when disintegration would have been easier. And once someone has seen that kind of material under pressure, they stop asking for proof. They stop expecting reaction. They adjust. Quietly. Permanently. You handled pressure most people never could, and now they're trying to understand how. But the truth is already in front of them. You didn't step away from yourself when it mattered, and that's something pressure can't touch. What follows after that understanding isn't attention, it's restraint. People no longer feel the urge to push you into situations to see how you'll react. They don't manufacture urgency around you. They don't lean on pressure as a shortcut, because they already know where that road ends. You become someone they account for, not someone they test. That's the quiet outcome of enduring what most people don't. It doesn't turn you into a symbol. It turns you into a reference point. Others recalibrate themselves in your presence without realizing they're doing it. They slow down. They choose words more carefully. They hesitate before trying to rush outcomes. Not because you demand it, because something in them recognizes that pressure has already failed here. You don't need to protect this state. You don't maintain it through effort. It maintains itself because it's built on memory. The body doesn't forget. The memory of weight that didn't move you. The memory of conditions that didn't disrupt you. From that point on, your past doesn't explain you. It stabilizes you. And stability like that doesn't invite curiosity forever. It ends it. People stop asking how you did it because they sense the answer isn't transferable. It wasn't learned in comfort. It wasn't learned quickly. It was earned where most people choose escape instead. You made it through what most people don't. And once that's understood deeply enough, there's nothing left to say. The pressure already asked its question, and you already answered it by staying intact. And that's where the story ends for good. Not with explanation, not with admiration, with certainty. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken because it's already integrated into how people move around you. They no longer wonder what would happen if things got hard again. They already know. They don't imagine how you might respond under pressure. They've seen enough to understand that pressure doesn't bargain here. It reveals. And what it revealed in you was something most people never develop, because they never stay long enough in the conditions that shape it. You didn't come out louder. You didn't come out harder. You came out settled. And settled people are the most difficult to unsettle, because nothing external holds their center hostage. That's why this isn't a phase or a reputation you have to defend. It's a position, one you reached without declaring it, without performing for it, without needing anyone to agree. People feel it and adjust. That's the final outcome of handling pressure most people never could. You don't carry the past as a badge. You don't relive it as a wound. You don't use it as leverage. It simply exists as proof that when conditions tightened and escape was available, you stayed. When pressure was understandable, you remained intact. When disintegration would have been easier, you held alignment. And alignment under weight doesn't fade. It becomes the standard by which everything else is measured. They're trying to understand what you're really made of, but the answer doesn't sit in words. It sits in the fact that pressure already tested you and moved on. Nothing else needs to. And if there's anything left after that, it's this. Pressure didn't just test you once and leave. It changed how the world approaches you going forward. Not because you demand respect, because respect is the natural response to something that holds. People don't challenge what already proved its limits. They don't rush what already endured urgency. They don't try to undo what has already been through conditions far more demanding than the ones in front of them now. That's why this isn't a moment you revisit, or a story you tell. It's a quiet baseline that guides everything ahead. You don't announce it. You don't protect it. You don't even think about it anymore. It's already installed. Pressure asked its question in the only language it knows. You answered without words, and answers like that don't echo. They settle. They closed the door behind them. You handled pressure most people never could. Not by becoming something new, but by staying exactly who you were when giving up would have been easier. That's what you're really made of. And once that's known, nothing else needs proving. You didn't interrupt them. You didn't correct them. You didn't rush to expose anything. That's the part they never understood. They assumed silence meant uncertainty. They assumed patience meant hesitation. They thought you were waiting for the right moment to speak. You weren't waiting at all. You already knew that when people are given enough space, they reveal exactly who they are without assistance. Truth doesn't need pressure. It needs time. So you let them talk. Let them explain. Let them justify. Every sentence they added was another thread pulled loose. Every movement they made was another signal they didn't realize they were sending. You weren't passive. You were precise. You understood that intervention only contaminates the outcome. When you step in too early, people adjust. They perform. They edit themselves. You denied them that advantage. You didn't challenge their narrative. You let it stretch until it could no longer support itself. And when something can no longer support itself, it resolves on its own. That's what happened. The truth didn't explode. It didn't need drama. It simply stepped forward, once there was nothing left sustaining the illusion. That's the kind of exposure that can't be argued with, because it wasn't forced. It was observed. They didn't realize they were being measured the entire time. Not by questions, not by confrontation, by consistency. You watched how their story changed depending on who was listening, how their confidence rose and fell with approval, how their tone shifted when they thought they had momentum. None of that required response from you. Patterns reveal themselves when no one interferes. You let the room stay neutral so their behavior couldn't hide behind resistance. People only mask when they feel pressure. You applied none, and without pressure, performance gives way. They started filling the silence themselves, over-explaining, doubling back, adding details that weren't asked for. That's always the signal. Truth doesn't rush to be believed. Falsehood does. You didn't need to trap them. You let them construct their own path and continue forward without interruption. Every step reduced flexibility. Every word narrowed the direction. They thought they were clarifying. They were exposing. Calm doesn't provoke mistakes. It allows them. And once allowed, mistakes accumulate. Not loudly, quietly, until the picture becomes undeniable. You weren't collecting evidence. You were letting evidence collect itself. And when it finally stood on its own, there was nothing you needed to say. The room already knew. What made it unavoidable was how little you did. You didn't guide the conversation. You didn't steer the outcome. You didn't even signal suspicion. That's why the truth had nowhere to hide. Most people rush to expose falsehood because they want resolution. You weren't looking for resolution. You were looking for accuracy. And accuracy requires distance. So you stayed still while they kept adjusting their version of events. Small inconsistencies at first, harmless contradictions, then timing that didn't line up, motives that shifted depending on advantage. You didn't react to any of it, and that lack of reaction removed their ability to recalibrate. People rely on feedback to maintain deception. They need cues, approval, resistance, anything that tells them how to adapt. You gave them nothing. And without feedback, they defaulted to impulse. Impulse always reveals intent. You could see it in the way they accelerated when they thought they were convincing, in the way they slowed when they sensed doubt, but didn't know where it came from. The truth wasn't dragged out of them. It stepped forward on its own, once the structure holding everything together lost stability. That's the nature of allowing people to speak freely. Eventually, they forget what they were trying to protect. That's when the shift becomes visible. Not to them at first, to everyone else. The room stops leaning in their direction. Attention loosens. Certainty fades. You didn't accuse. You didn't correct. You didn't even signal conclusion. You let gravity do the work. When people are allowed to act without interruption, they eventually reveal what drives them. When they think no one is guiding the moment, they begin optimizing for comfort instead of truth. They prioritize image over coherence. And once that trade-off appears, it can't be unseen. You stayed neutral long enough for neutrality to become contrast. Their movement started to look excessive. Their confidence started to feel rehearsed. Their explanations started to outrun the facts. This is where truth gains momentum, not through force, through inevitability. You didn't pressure them. They limited themselves by continuing. Each attempt to regain control narrowed their range. Each clarification reduced plausibility. And because you never interfered, no one could claim bias. No one could say the outcome was engineered. The truth walked forward cleanly, untouched by your hand. That's the power of restraint. It leaves no fingerprints. By then, they could sense it slipping, even if they couldn't name what it was. The certainty they walked in with no longer had a place to land. The room wasn't hostile. It wasn't impressed either. That neutrality carries weight. Hostility gives something to push against. Interest gives something to perform for. Neutrality offers nothing. You let it stay that way. You didn't rescue the moment. You didn't soften the silence. You didn't give them an exit disguised as grace. You allowed the pause to exist long enough for unease to surface. Unease doesn't come from accusation. It comes from realizing your narrative no longer controls perception. They tried to adjust. Slower words, firmer tone, a little more certainty injected where it was already thinning, but the structure was gone. Once coherence breaks, no amount of confidence restores it. People don't need proof at that stage. They sense alignment, or they don't. And alignment had already left the room. You weren't waiting for a confession. You were waiting for alignment to either return or fall away. It faded, quietly, without confrontation, without victory speeches. The truth didn't arrive as a tool of attack. It arrived as absence. The absence of belief. And absence doesn't argue. It simply remains empty. That absence seals the outcome. Once belief leaves, nothing they say can bring it back. They can add details, refine language, slow delivery, but it's already settled. Truth doesn't need to be louder than deception. It only needs to be steadier. You let steadiness prevail by refusing to rush the moment. You understood something most people don't. When you intervene, you give the other side something to react to. Reaction creates movement. Movement creates confusion. You removed all of that. You let the environment stay still enough for reality to show through. And reality has a weight that performance can't sustain for long. They weren't undone by logic. They were undone by continuity. Their story couldn't remain the same across time, across tone, across pressure. Yours didn't need to change at all. That's why the truth stepped forward on its own. It wasn't pulled, it wasn't forced. It emerged when everything artificial ran out of momentum. And when that happens, there's no debate. People don't argue with what they've already seen clearly. They simply move on, carrying the understanding with them. You didn't expose them. You let them reveal themselves. And that distinction endures. And once that understanding settles, it doesn't create drama. It creates space. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. That forms when people realize there's nothing left to manage. They don't confront what revealed itself. They don't demand closure. They simply stop investing. That's the signal. When truth steps forward on its own, it doesn't need discussion afterward. It reshapes behavior. You see it in how people disengage without explanation, in how conversations conclude earlier than expected, in how confidence drains from places it once sat comfortably. That conversation when their timeline shifted 3 times. Tuesday became Wednesday. Morning became afternoon. Around noon became maybe earlier. You said nothing, just listened. By the end, they couldn't remember which version they started with. The room understood. You didn't take anything from them. You simply stopped holding the framework together. And when a framework gives way without resistance, there's no accusation to place. That's the advantage of restraint. No fingerprints, no reversal, no claim to refute. Just clarity arriving on its own. You let them talk, move and act, because you knew that action without interruption always trends toward truth. People can maintain an image under pressure. They can maintain it under praise. They can even maintain it under challenge. What they can't maintain is consistency, when no one is guiding the moment. That's where reality asserts itself. And once it does, it doesn't need reinforcement. It doesn't need memory. It becomes the reference point going forward. You didn't expose the truth. You made space for it. And space is all it ever needed. What remains after that is something most people never notice. But everyone feels. The moment stops needing explanation. No one asks follow-up questions. No one revisits the details. Because once truth stands on its own, curiosity shuts down. Curiosity exists only when something still needs decoding. Here, nothing does. You didn't win an argument. You didn't control a narrative. You let time, consistency, and uninterrupted behavior do what pressure never could. People remember that, not consciously, instinctively. They carry it into future interactions as a quiet rule. When someone is allowed enough room, they eventually show what's real. When no one interferes, reality organizes itself. You didn't act superior. You acted patient. And patience, when it's real, isn't passive. It's decisive, without noise. That's why this outcome doesn't invite retaliation or debate. There's nothing to push against. The truth already stepped forward on its own, and once it does, it doesn't turn back. You don't need to reference the moment again. You don't need to defend your silence. The environment already adjusted. That's the highest level of influence there is. Not directing the outcome, but allowing the only possible outcome to arrive untouched, and where it settles completely. Not with confrontation, not with exposure as spectacle, with a lasting change in how people understand restraint. They stop mistaking silence for uncertainty. They stop assuming patience means weakness, because they've seen what happens when someone doesn't rush to interfere. The truth doesn't need assistance. It needs permission to surface. You gave it that by staying still, by refusing to contaminate the moment with reaction, by trusting that reality, given enough room, always corrects itself. People don't forget that lesson. They don't talk about it openly, but it shifts how they move afterward. They become more careful about what they say when no one interrupts, more aware of what their actions reveal when no one redirects them. You didn't teach this by instruction. You demonstrated it by absence. You demonstrated it by absence. And absence, when it's intentional, is unmistakable. You let them talk, move, and act. Not because you were disengaged, but because you understood something fundamental. The truth doesn't need to be chased. It doesn't need to be dragged into the light. It steps forward on its own when there's nothing left holding it back. And once it does, there's nothing anyone can say to place it where it came from. And that's the part most people never understand unless they've lived it. You didn't gain influence by speaking less. You gained influence by needing nothing from the outcome. The moment you stopped trying to manage appearances, interpretations, or reactions, the situation corrected itself without resistance. People assume truth needs help because they're used to chaos being louder. But chaos only persists when someone feeds it attention. You didn't. You let it lose momentum naturally. And when effort fades, what was being hidden becomes visible. After that, no one needed persuading. No explanation could improve what was already clear. The truth didn't arrive as a conclusion people debated. It arrived as something people adjusted to. They changed how they behaved, how they invested, how they trusted. That's how you know it was real. Real truth doesn't argue. It rearranges. You didn't expose anything. You removed interference. And once interference is gone, reality doesn't hesitate. It steps forward exactly as it is. Clean, clear, complete. That's why this outcome lasts, because you didn't win by force. You let the only possible outcome step forward on its own, much later. Usually when the moment is long gone, something else settles in. They realize you were never waiting for the truth to appear so you could use it. You were waiting so you wouldn't have to. That's the part that changes how they see you long term. Anyone can expose something when they're invested in the outcome. Very few can step back far enough to let reality speak without translation. That distance isn't coldness, it's discipline. It means you trust coherence more than control. You trust time more than urgency. You trust consistency more than persuasion. And once people understand that about you, they stop trying to pull you into reactions altogether. They don't expect commentary. They don't look for validation. They don't assume you'll intervene to fix what they're doing, because they know now if something is real, it will stand. And if it isn't, it won't last when left alone. You didn't make yourself unreadable. You made yourself unnecessary to the outcome. That's the highest position there is. Not influence, not dominance, but freedom from deception. And once someone reaches that, the truth doesn't need help anymore. It knows where to go. And that's where it ends in the only way it ever could, with no need for you to stand in the center of it. No need for acknowledgement. No need for aftermath. The truth didn't step forward to crown you. It stepped forward because nothing was left holding it back. You didn't demand honesty. You made dishonesty unsustainable. You didn't force clarity. You removed the noise that kept clarity from forming. That's why this stays with people long after the moment fades. Not as a lesson they repeat, as a rule they follow without realizing it. They become more careful about what they say when no one interrupts, more aware of what their actions reveal when no one rushes them. They learn, quietly, that time is unforgiving to what isn't real, and they remember the one person who proved it without lifting a finger. You didn't expose anything. You didn't accuse. You didn't confront. You trusted reality enough to step out of its way. And reality rewarded that trust by correcting itself fully. Once that happens, there's nothing left to add, no recognition to claim, no explanation to offer. The truth already arrived exactly how it was meant to, on its own. And the last thing that becomes clear is this. You didn't succeed because you were smarter. You didn't succeed because you were colder. You succeeded because you were absent from the one place distortion needs most. Reaction. False narratives rely on response. Misguidance relies on pulling someone into motion. You gave it neither. You stayed still long enough for reality to finish the sentence on its own. That's why this doesn't fade with time. People don't remember what you said. They remember what happened when you said nothing. They remember how things unraveled without pressure, how clarity arrived without force, how the moment resolved itself without your involvement. And that memory reshapes how they approach situations long after you're gone. They hesitate before performing. They slow down before shaping stories. They sense that time exposes what effort tries to conceal. You became proof of that, without trying to be. Not a warning, not an example, a quiet constant. You let them talk, move, and act, and the truth stepped forward on its own because nothing else was possible. And once someone understands that truth doesn't need to be chased, only left alone, they never see silence the same way again.